Modern sealed motorcycle wheel bearings are very reliable and seldom give you an issue within their 80,000 to 120,000 mile life expectancy. Now that's provided you don't do anything out of the ordinary with your motorcycle, and I know none of you do anything like that. Swing arm and suspension linkage bearings with some maintenance will last even longer, but if neglected, they will start to make noise and deliver a degraded ride quality. Today I'm covering the replacement of major bearing sets in the wheel and the swing arm, and we'll show you some little tricks I use to make this job easier at home in your own garage. As I mentioned, a sealed wheel bearing should last for a very long time, but fording deep water, plowing through mud, stressing the bearing by hammering the front wheel down from a wheelie, or even something as innocuous as having the bearing sit in one position, leaving the bike unmoved for years on end, can and will take more than a few years off a bearing's life. If you're a subscriber to the channel, you'll recognize the bike I'm working on today. It's my free ZX-6 Ninja that had been sitting outside in a neighbor's yard for 15 years or so. All of the bearings are getting changed on this bike, one because the condition of them is truly unknown, and having them sit stationary for so long has caused some corrosive flat spots. 2, changing bearings isn't expensive, it's just a little time consuming. And 3, if we get the sport bike back on the road, I want no question of safety when traveling at highway speeds, or from time to time, a little more than highway speeds. These wheels were off the bike since I was installing new tires, and if you need some help doing that job yourself, check out this video that'll show you how to change your tire in your own garage with nothing more than some tire spoons and glass cleaner. Whenever I change tires, I check the wheel bearings to ensure that the inner races turn smoothly and there's no weird flat spots or wear on the axle. If there's any sort of bump, snag, or anything other than a rotation that is not silky smooth,
I love it.
Of course you do. I make you silky smooth. I tell you this.
The bearings in your bike will only degrade quicker over a short period of time, and this is an indication that you need to change the bearings now. Bearings should be snug in the wheel hub or swing arm, and there should be no play between the bearing and the wheel or swing arm casting. Also no play in the inner and outer races of the bearing. Since single-sided swing arm bikes have wheel bearings in the swing arm hub that are different in that they're larger, can be cleaned relatively easily, and lubricated without removing them from the swing arm, we are going to focus on the front wheel, since every bike has a setup just like this one on the Kawasaki. You'll notice that the front wheel is resting on two 2-inch by 2-inch pieces of wood. Now I'm going to be hammering on the bearings to remove and install the new ones, and I don't want to damage either the rim or the brake rotors. So these blocks of wood give me the support and spacing I need. To start, we need to remove the seal that's sitting on the bearing. Components like the bearing seal and the bearing should never be reused, so if removing them, make sure that you have a complete kit specifically for your motorcycle before you start repairing this. If you need help with that, there's a link in the description below. Under the seal is an inner snap ring that's holding the bearing in place on this particular rim. The opposite side of the rim also has a snap ring that held the speedometer drive in place, which is also removed. These snap rings are okay to reuse provided they're straight, aren't corroded, and still have plenty of spring in them. Otherwise, replace them. Your rim may not have an outer snap ring. Some rims have a machined recess that hold the bearing at a predetermined depth in the hub, so they don't need that snap ring. Also, check your specific shop manual for any additional oddities. Like on my GL 1800 Goldwing, the shop manual insists the front brake rotors be removed since they mount to the hub, and if left on the wheel, make bearing and seal extraction and installation difficult. Driving the old bearings out require nothing more than a hammer and a long punch. To start with, I like to gain a little workspace around the bearing inside the hub. To do that, I either take a bearing driver or a hardened impact socket that is close to the same size as the bearing to allow me to give the bearing one solid tap, just to get it freed up and provide the room needed to angle the spacer between the bearings in the hub. I need to do this to angle the spacer so I can make contact with the bearing from the opposite side of the wheel. This This will allow me to use a long punch and hammer to drive the bearing out. I have to try and move the bearing out without wedging it in the wheel. So a few taps on one side, adjust the punch and bearing spacer to the opposite side, and then repeat. I'm just driving the bearing out, and there's no need to be gentle or care particularly about the bearing being removed. These old bearings are not being reused, and I wouldn't remove them if there wasn't a problem, or I wasn't replacing them, so any potential damage to the old bearing is inconsequential. Once the first bearing is out, the spacer can be removed, inspected, and cleaned. This spacer is sometimes called a distance collar. It's made of aluminum, so it can be cleaned and reused. If the ends were distorted, the interior badly scored, or the spacer was rusted up because your bike used a steel spacer or distance collar instead of an aluminum one, I would replace it with a brand new one. Now I can flip the wheel over and hammer out the bearing the same way. Of course, this is a lot easier since there's nothing obstructing access to it from the inside of the hub. Bearings out, I can clean up the wheel hub and make sure there's no dirt where the bearing will sit inside the wheel. The next step is not really necessary, but I like to put the new wheel bearings in the freezer for a few hours before installing them. I think it makes the job easier since the cold will, in theory, shrink the bearings a micron or two, and they will slide into the hub with less stress on the bearing. The other thing I like to do is apply some lubricant to the inside of the wheel to help slide the bearings in. I also like to check the new wheel bearing against the old ones just to make sure they're the same outside diameter. The new wheel bearings will have a manufacturing mark on the side of it, and this is the side that faces outward. Installing the new bearing is a process of applying pressure at specific points. To make this foolproof, I'm using a driver which is very close to the same diameter as the bearing. This way, the force of the hammer blow is directed across the side of the bearing, but more specifically across the outside race edges. As long as the bearing is pressed squarely into the wheel hub, it will move in easily. In the case of this wheel, I'll install the inner snap ring to hold this bearing in place before I turn the wheel over and install the bearing spacer and opposite side wheel bearing. The spacer or distance collar needs to be squared up to the bearings, so make sure you check the alignment before you finish driving the second wheel bearing all the way home with that driver and hammer.
Nice.
Now I can install the seal, and I use a little grease on the seal to help with installation and to keep water out of this area, and use the seal driver to set it into the hub. Final check is to reach inside with your finger and make sure the inner races are turning freely on those bearings, and that spacer is reinstalled in the proper place. Now you can reinstall any additional components that you've removed to get the bearings out, like brake rotors or speedometer drives. In the case of this Kawasaki, I also changed the rear wheel bearings that included this open bearing in the sprocket drive. The original was designed to be removed, cleaned, and repacked, I think, but the new bearing is sealed like the ones in the rest of the wheel bearings. Although all the original wheel bearings seemed okay on this bike, I couldn't say for sure how long they would hold up, rolling down the highway at over 900 RPM. If you're learning something or just enjoying the video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't be afraid to share it with your friends on your Facebook page or a forum or your Reddit subgroup. If you're new here, hit subscribe because it's free and helps you find more useful videos for you and your bike from the channel. Now, all this does actually help me out, and I really do appreciate it, so thanks for watching. After removing the swing arm from the bike, I found that the roller bearing had a flat spot and would not turn freely. These bearings should be lubricated every 10,000 kilometers on this bike, and the swing arm on this old Kawasaki even has grease zerks to help with this. Now, I would personally recommend manually greasing these bearings and not relying on the zerks for lubrication. I would also say that for most motorcyclists, this service is even less likely to be done by a previous owner than cleaning and repacking the steering head bearings, despite this being a whole lot easier to do. Swing arm bearings can be purchased individually from your manufacturer or in complete kits. I found a complete kit on eBay when I couldn't get one from the standard sources here in Canada or from Kawasaki. The seller was based out of Europe, and the whole 4 bearing and seal kit was about the same price as the single bearing I needed for this bike if I bought it from Kawasaki, if it ever came off back order. If you're looking for swing arm bearings for your own bike, I put a link in the description below. After removing the seals, getting these bearings out can be a little bit of a challenge. I'm using a long piece of about 5/8 aluminum rod to get to the bearing from the opposite side. Resting the swing arm on one of those blocks of wood and holding the swing arm between my legs, I can drive the bearings out. The needle bearings in the swing arm are a little tricky to get out, so I'm using the bearing driver tool as well as the rod to push the bearings out and get them moving. Once the bearings are out, I can degrease and clean up the swing arm before putting the new bearings in. Driving the new needle bearing in is simple with the bearing driver tool and a little spray lubricant on the outer races. Once the bearings are set, I lubricate them with moly grease from the inside. Moly has one of the best water-resistant properties available in a grease. Now, these bearings do not rotate at high speeds like wheel bearings, but they do have to carry the weight of the bike over a large surface area with rapidly changing directions. The swing arm also has a large open roller bearing on one end, and this has to be packed with grease. For this initial packing, I will use lithium complex grease that will penetrate all of the bearing surfaces much more easily than moly grease would. The outer bearing surface will be coated with a thin layer of moly to help keep water out before the snap ring and seal are put in place. I also put a layer of moly on the back side of the seal, just to make sure the water will not get into these bearings anytime soon. After remounting the swing arm and bringing it up to torque spec, I thoroughly cleaned the suspension linkage roller sleeves, lubricated all the suspension pivot bearings by hand, reinstalled and torqued them to Kawasaki specification. Swing arm installed, I could then mount the rear wheel with a new sprocket and chain. I'm getting close to finishing this bike, and very soon I will reveal the fully restored ZX-6, so please look forward to that. If you've missed any of the restoration story for this bike, be sure to check out this playlist where I get this abandoned bike, neglect it myself for over a year, and then slowly and as cost effectively bring it back to life. I hope you check it out. And until next time, be sure to ride safe.